In the heart of the city, where glass towers touched the clouds and the streets hummed with a never-ending rush of people, there was a place of quiet chaos. It was the great atrium of the Central Arts Center, a massive space of marble floors and towering glass walls. Sunlight poured down from a high skylight, making dust motes dance in the golden beams like tiny, silent fairies. And in the very center of this light, like a king on its throne, sat a grand piano. It wasn't roped off or hidden behind a velvet rope. It was just there, its polished, dark wood reflecting the world around it, a silent invitation to anyone who dared to make it sing. Every day. The atrium was a river of people flowing through. There were tourists with cameras slung around their necks, their heads tilted back as they stared at the architecture. There were office workers on their lunch breaks, clutching coffee cups and talking in loud, hurried voices. And there were the students from the music conservatory next door, easily recognizable by the instrument cases they carried and the confident, slightly tired look in their eyes. Most of them would give the piano a passing glance, a nod of professional respect. A few, the bold ones, would sit down and play. Their music would fill the space, sharp and clear notes that would rise up and get lost in the high ceiling. They played pieces by famous composers, their fingers flying across the keys with a speed and precision that was amazing to watch. It was the kind of performance that made people stop and nod appreciatively before they moved on to their next destination. The music was brilliant, a perfect storm of technical skill, but it often felt like it was missing something. It was like looking at a perfectly painted picture of a fire. You could see all the colors and shapes, but you couldn't feel the warmth. And then there was the young woman. She was a part of the crowd, but not really. She was like a small, quiet eddy in the rushing river, always finding a spot on the edge of things. She would arrive around the same time each afternoon, not carrying a camera or a briefcase, but just a simple cloth bag. She never spoke to anyone, and no one really seemed to notice her. She would find a marble bench a little distance from the piano, a spot that gave her a clear view without being too close. She would sit, her posture slightly stooped, and her hands would usually be tucked into the pockets of her plain, worn jacket. Her eyes were always on the piano. She watched it with an intensity that made it seem like she was the only one in the room who truly saw it. She watched the students as they played. She didn't just see their fingers. She saw the way their wrists bent, the way their shoulders relaxed or tensed, the subtle sway of their bodies as they lost themselves in the music. She was a student of the piano, but she had never had a lesson. Her classroom was this bustling atrium, and her teachers were the strangers who came and went each day. A deep, unspoken longing lived inside her, a quiet ache that grew a little stronger every time she heard the first notes of a song. It was a feeling so powerful it sometimes made it hard to breathe. She would close her eyes for a moment, and the sounds of the atrium would fade away. In her mind, it was her hands on those cool ivory keys. She could feel the smoothness under her fingertips, the slight resistance as she pressed a key down, and the deep, satisfying vibration that would travel up through the wood and into her bones. In her head, she played every song she heard, not just copying the notes, but feeling the emotion behind them. She would add her own little flourishes, her own pauses, her own soul. It was a secret world, a beautiful, private concert that no one else could ever hear. But then she would open her eyes, and the reality would come crashing back in. She would slowly pull one hand out of her pocket and look at it. It was her hand, but it was different. It was smaller than most, and the fingers were not long and graceful like the ones she saw on the piano. On her right hand, there were only 3 fully formed fingers, and on her left, just 2. The others were just small, delicate stumps, a silent reminder of the way she was born. All her life, those hands had defined her in ways she hated. Well-meaning teachers had gently guided her away from art classes that required fine motor skills. Other children, not meaning to be cruel but being so anyway, had stared and asked questions in loud whispers. The message, spoken and unspoken, was always the same. Some things are not for you. And the piano, with its 88 keys demanding a full, capable hand, was the ultimate, not for you. It was a dream that felt like a joke. She remembered once when she was very small, a kind relative had let her touch the keys of an old upright piano. The sound it made, a single, clear chime, had been the most beautiful thing she had ever heard. But her mother had quickly pulled her away. "Oh, sweetheart, that's not for you," she had said, her voice full of pity. "You might break it." The words had stung more than any insult. They had planted a seed of doubt that had grown into a thorny bush of shame around her heart. So she learned to hide her hands. She became an expert at keeping them in her pockets, or tucked behind her back, or clasped together in her lap. She watched the world with her eyes, but she rarely participated with her hands. Except in her mind. In her mind, her hands were perfect. They were strong and capable, dancing across the keys, creating music that could make people stop and truly listen. Music that could make them feel something deep and real. As a young man in a tailored coat finished a complicated piece with a dramatic flourish, the small crowd applauded politely. He gave a short, sharp bow, a proud smile on his face, and then walked away, leaving the piano empty and silent again. The young woman on the bench watched him go, her expression unreadable. The silence that followed his performance felt heavier than the music itself. It was an empty silence, a waiting silence. And in that moment, the longing inside her was so sharp, so real, it felt like a physical weight on her chest. She looked at the empty piano bench, then down at her hands, still hidden safely in her pockets. What would it even feel like? To just walk over there, to sit down, to feel the cool wood of the bench against her back, to place her imperfect hands on those perfect keys and just... See? The thought was terrifying and exhilarating all at once. It was a crazy, impossible idea. But as she sat there, in the golden light of the atrium, with the silent piano waiting, the idea didn't seem quite so impossible anymore. The days turned into weeks, and the young woman's routine became a ritual. She was a ghost in the machine of the bustling arts center, a silent observer in a world of noise. The longing inside her, once a sharp ache, had settled into a deep, heavy hum, a constant companion. She had become an expert at watching, at living her musical dreams secondhand through the hands of others. She knew which students played with passion and which played for praise. She knew which pieces could make a tired businessman stop and close his eyes for just a moment. But she never crossed the line. The space between her marble bench and the piano's polished wood bench was a chasm. She never dared to bridge. Then, one particular Tuesday, something shifted. The atrium was more alive than usual, filled with the bright chatter of a school tour group. A little girl, no older than 6, broke away from her mother and ran gleefully towards the grand piano. Her mother called after her, but the child, in a bubble of pure, innocent joy, clambered onto the bench. Her small hands, with no training or knowledge, came down on the keys in a loud, discordant crash. It wasn't music. It was noise. But the child threw her head back and laughed, a sound so full of delight that it cut through all the other sounds in the atrium. She banged on the keys again, creating another chaotic symphony, her feet swinging happily above the floor. No one mocked her. No one whispered. People just smiled, amused by the unbridled creativity of a child who didn't know the rules. Watching her, the young woman felt something crack inside her. That little girl didn't care about technique or about having the right kind of hands. She just saw a big, beautiful toy and wanted to make a sound. A thought so wild and dangerous it made her heart skip a beat bloomed in her mind. Asterisk, why not me? Asterisk, the idea was terrifying. It felt like standing on the edge of a very tall building. But the little girl's laughter echoed in her ears, a tiny, brave sound against a lifetime of, "You can't." The girl's mother finally came and gently led her away, leaving the piano silent once more. The crowd moved on, but the young woman didn't. She stayed on her bench, her hands clenched into fists inside her pockets, her knuckles white. The internal war was raging. A voice that sounded a lot like her mother's, like her teacher's, like every staring stranger, screamed at her to stay put. Asterisk, don't be ridiculous. You'll be a spectacle. They'll laugh at you. You'll embarrass yourself. Asterisk, but another, quieter voice, a voice she hadn't heard before, whispered back. Asterisk, but what if they don't? What if just one note, just one, is as beautiful as you imagine? Asterisk before she could talk herself out of it, she was on her feet. Her legs felt like they were made of wood, heavy and uncooperative. Every step towards the piano was a monumental effort. The 10 meters of marble floor between her bench and the instrument stretched out like a vast, empty desert. The sounds of the atrium seemed to fade into a dull roar, like the ocean in a seashell. Her world narrowed to a single point, the smooth, empty bench waiting for her. She could feel eyes on her. A few people noticed her movement, their expressions curious. She kept her gaze fixed forward, afraid that if she made eye contact with anyone, she would shatter. Leaning against a pillar near the piano was a small group of conservatory students. They had just finished their own performance, a loud and flashy piece that was more about speed than feeling. They were tuning their instruments and talking amongst themselves, their postures radiating an air of effortless superiority. They were the kind of people who had never been told no in their entire lives. As she drew closer, one of them, a young man with a perfectly styled haircut, noticed her. He nudged his friend, a girl holding a violin case, and nodded in her direction. The girl followed his gaze, and a small, cruel smile played on her lips. The young woman's heart hammered against her ribs. She wanted to turn back. She wanted to run. But her feet kept moving, pulled by an invisible thread towards the one thing she desired most. She reached the piano. The wood was even more beautiful up close, gleaming under the skylight. She could see her own distorted reflection in the glossy black surface, a pale, nervous-looking ghost. Slowly, carefully, she lifted herself onto the bench. It was firm and cool against her back. The smell of old wood and wax filled her nose. It was a smell she had only ever imagined from a distance. For a moment she just sat there, her hands still hidden in her pockets, her back ramrod straight. She was aware of every single sound around her now. The shuffle of feet, the distant ring of a phone, and most clearly the snickers from the group by the pillar. "Look at her," the girl with the violin whispered, just loud enough to carry. "Is this a joke?" "I think she's actually going to play," the young man replied, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "This should be good." A wave of hot, prickly shame washed over the young woman. Her cheeks burned. This was it. This was the nightmare she had always feared. She was the center of attention, but not for the reason she wanted. She was a freak show. The urge to flee was overwhelming, a physical force pulling at her muscles. She could just stand up, walk away, and go back to her safe, invisible spot on the bench. No one would blame her. It was the sensible thing to do, but then she looked down at the keys. 88 white and black rectangles stretching out in front of her like a promise. They were silent. They were waiting. They weren't judging her. They were just an opportunity, waiting for someone to take it. The whispers from the group grew louder. What's she going to do? Pat the keys with her palms? One of them snorted, and the others burst out in a chorus of quiet, ugly laughter. The sound was like a slap in the face. It was everything she had ever been afraid of, happening right here, in front of everyone. Her vision blurred with tears of humiliation. Her fingers, still tucked away in her pockets, curled into tight fists. This was a mistake. A horrible, terrible mistake, but then something strange happened. As the laughter washed over her, it didn't break her. Instead, it solidified something inside her. It was as if her fear, having reached its absolute peak, had nowhere left to go but to turn into something else. A flicker of defiance. A tiny hot spark of anger. Not at them, but at the years of doubt, at the voices that had held her back. They could laugh. They could whisper. They could mock. But they couldn't stop her. Slowly, deliberately, she pulled her hands out of her pockets. She didn't look at the group. She didn't look at the few people who were now watching with a mix of pity and curiosity. She looked only at the keys. She saw her hands, her small, different hands, hovering over the ivory. And in that moment, she didn't see them as a source of shame. She saw them as they were, a part of her. The only part she had. She took a deep, shaky breath, the air filling her lungs and chasing away the last of the doubt. The laughter was still there, a background noise, but it was fading. She closed her eyes, shutting out the mocking faces, the pitying glances, and the entire world. There was only her and the silence of the keys waiting to be broken. The world outside her eyelids disappeared. The mocking whispers, the curious stares, the vast, echoing space of the atrium, it all faded into a distant, irrelevant hum. In the darkness behind her closed eyes, there was only the feeling of the cool, smooth ivory beneath her hands and the quiet hum of anticipation in her own heart. For a moment she did nothing. She just let her hands rest on the keys, her small, unique fingers and the soft pads of her palms making contact with the instrument for the first time. It was a gentle, almost reverent touch, like a blind person reading the face of a loved one for the very first time. Then she took a breath, a slow, deep inhalation that seemed to pull all the silence in the room into her lungs. As she began to play, the first sound was not a note, but a feeling. It was a low, deep hum created by the heel of her left hand pressing gently on a group of bass notes. It wasn't a chord in the traditional sense. It was a foundation, a deep, resonant sigh that vibrated through the wood of the piano and up through her arm. It was the sound of loneliness, of quiet observation. A few people in the crowd shifted, confused. This wasn't music. Not in the way they were used to. The group of students by the pillar exchanged smirks, their arms crossed in triumphant judgment. But the young woman on the bench didn't notice. She was already gone, lost in the world she was creating. From that deep, humming foundation, a single, clear note emerged. It was played with the tip of her longest finger on her right hand. The note hung in the air, pure and fragile, like a single star in a dark sky. Then another note, and another. It was a simple melody, hesitant at first, like a voice that hasn't been used in a long time, testing its own sound. It was the melody she had heard in her head 1,000 times, the one she had composed in her mind during countless hours on her marble bench. As she grew more confident, her right hand began to move more freely. She used her 3 fingers to pluck out the tune, while her palm and the base of her thumb would occasionally press down, creating soft, unexpected harmonies that filled in the spaces around the melody. It was a completely unorthodox technique, a style born out of necessity and imagination. Her hands didn't just play the piano. They became one with it, moving across the keys in a fluid, organic dance that was mesmerizing to watch. The simple melody began to grow. It was no longer just a lonely tune. It started to ask questions. The notes became a little faster, a little more insistent. She used her left hand, with its 2 fingers and palm, to create a rhythmic pulse underneath the right hand's melody, a steady heartbeat that gave the music a new sense of purpose. The sound was richer and more complex than anything the conservatory students had produced. Their music was technically perfect, but it was a copy. This was original. This was a story. The music began to speak of her years of watching, of feeling invisible. There was a sadness to it, a deep, melancholic ache that everyone in the room could feel. It was the sound of wanting something you were told you could never have. An old man, who had been waiting for his wife near the entrance, stopped and tilted his head, a faraway look in his eyes. The music was reaching him, reminding him of a long-forgotten regret. The mocking students were no longer smirking. They were standing perfectly still, their instruments forgotten at their sides. They were musicians, and they could recognize something they had never been taught. They could see the logic in her unconventional method, the way she used her entire hand to create sounds that were simply impossible with just 10 fingers. They were watching a masterclass, but it was in a language they didn't understand. The girl with the violin unconsciously tightened her grip on her case, her own confidence suddenly feeling thin and hollow. Then the music began to change again. The questioning melody found an answer. A new theme was introduced, brighter and more hopeful, weaving its way through the sadness. It was a sound of resilience, of a spirit that refused to be broken. The rhythm from her left hand became stronger, more determined. The young woman's body, which had been still and stooped, began to move. Her shoulders, once hunched in shame, now squared with a quiet strength. She swayed slightly with the music, her whole being now invested in the story she was telling. The atrium was completely silent. The river of people had stopped flowing. Everyone was standing still, their faces turned towards the piano, their expressions a mixture of awe and confusion. They were no longer watching a girl with different hands play a piano. They were listening to a soul speaking its truth. The music continued to build, layer upon layer of emotion. The hopeful theme grew stronger, pushing back against the melancholy until it was no longer just a question, but a statement. It was a statement of defiance. The sound swelled, filling the massive space, bouncing off the glass walls and marble floors. It was no longer just beautiful. It was powerful. It was a tidal wave of sound, a cry of triumph that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. She was using her palms now, striking full chords with a force that seemed impossible for someone so small. The music was fierce and loud and utterly magnificent. It was the sound of every no she had ever heard being screamed back as a yes. It was the sound of chains breaking. A young mother, holding her little girl's hand, had tears streaming down her face. She wasn't sad. She was feeling something else, something powerful and inspiring. She squeezed her daughter's hand, not to hold her back, but to share the moment, and then, just as the music reached its absolute peak, a breathtaking, overwhelming crescendo that filled every corner of the room, it began to soften. The powerful chords receded, leaving the bright, hopeful theme to play on its own. It was gentler now, but not weak. It was the sound of peace after a long battle, the calm that comes after a storm. The melody simplified again, returning to the single, clear notes from the beginning, but now they were different. They were no longer hesitant or lonely. They were full and confident, shining with a quiet, earned joy. She played a final, soft chord, a sound that was both beautiful and a little bit heartbreaking, and then she let her hands rest on the keys, letting the sound ring out and fade into the air. The last vibration of the string disappeared into the silence, leaving a profound, charged emptiness in its wake. The music was over, but the story had just been heard. The final chord didn't just end. It dissolved. It hung in the air for a moment, a shimmering, fragile thing, and then it seemed to be absorbed by the towering glass walls and the marble floor, leaving behind a silence that was more profound than any sound that had come before. It was a heavy, living silence, a space so thick with unspoken emotion that it felt like a physical presence in the room. The river of people, the constant hum of the city, the distant sirens, the ringing of phones, all of it had vanished. In this moment, the atrium was a sacred space, and the silence was its congregation. On the bench, the young woman's shoulders, which had been squared with strength during the performance, now slumped slightly. The energy that had poured out of her had left her feeling empty, like a vessel drained to its very last drop. Her eyes, still closed, fluttered open. For a second, her vision was blurry, the world awash of soft light and dark shapes. She was back in the room, but a part of her was still wandering in the landscape of the music she had just created. She could feel the cool, smooth ivory under her hands, her fingers still resting on the keys as if they were afraid to let go. Her breathing was shallow and fast, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She braced herself, expecting the world to rush back in the whispers, the pity, the polite, awkward applause. She expected to feel the familiar sting of shame, but the world did not rush back in. The silence held, slowly, her focus sharpened. She began to see the faces in the crowd, and what she saw made her breath catch in her throat. An old man standing near the entrance, his face a roadmap of wrinkles, was slowly wiping a tear from his cheek with the back of a trembling hand. He wasn't looking at her, but at some distant point only he could see, lost in a memory that the music had unlocked. Near him, a young mother was crying freely, her shoulders shaking silently, but she had a small, beautiful smile on her face. She was looking down at her little girl, who wasn't crying at all, but was staring at the piano with wide, mesmerized eyes, her small mouth slightly agape. As if she had just witnessed a bit of magic, the young woman's gaze drifted further into the crowd. A man in a crisp, expensive suit, who had been yelling into his phone just minutes before, now stood perfectly still. His phone was on the floor at his feet, forgotten. His tie was loosened, and his face, usually a mask of impatience and stress, was soft and vulnerable. He was just staring, his jaw slack, a single tear tracing a path down his cheek. He looked like a man who had been woken from a long, loud dream and was finally seeing the world clearly for the first time. A group of teenagers who had been lounging against a wall with an air of bored indifference were now standing up straight. They weren't talking or laughing. They were just watching, their usual cynical expressions replaced by one of raw, unguarded awe. One of the boys quickly turned away, scrubbing at his eyes with the heel of his hand. Embarrassed by the emotion he couldn't control, then her eyes found the group by the pillar. The students. The ones who had mocked her. The sight of them sent a jolt of old fear through her, but it was quickly replaced by a feeling she couldn't name. The young man with the perfectly styled hair was ashen. His air of superiority had vanished, replaced by a look of utter disbelief. He was staring at his own hands, turning them over and over as if they were foreign objects, suddenly clumsy and inadequate. He was a musician, and he had just been shown what music truly was. He had spent years mastering the notes, but he had never learned to speak the language. The girl with the violin was looking at the floor, her face burning with a deep crimson shame. The cruel smirk was gone, erased as if it had never been there. Her violin case, once a symbol of her pride and talent, now looked like a heavy burden in her hand. She couldn't bring herself to look at the piano or at the young woman on the bench. The weight of their whispered words hung in the air between them, a toxic cloud that was now choking them with regret. A quiet sniffle came from another direction. Then another. It was like a chain reaction, a silent, rippling wave of emotion. A woman pulled a tissue from her purse and dabbed at her eyes. A man in a worker's uniform took off his cap and held it to his chest, his head bowed. It wasn't loud, theatrical crying. It was a deeply personal, quiet release. The music had been a key, and it had unlocked something in each of them, a forgotten grief, a buried hope, a long-lost joy. They were all crying for different reasons, but they were crying together. The atrium, a place of transient noise and hurried footsteps, had become a cathedral of shared humanity. The young woman on the bench watched this transformation, her heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against her ribs. She saw the tears, the awe, the shame, the profound stillness on every face. These were not the looks of pity or mockery she had feared her entire life. These were looks of connection. She had poured her soul into the music, and her soul had been reflected back at her from 100 different faces. She had spent her life feeling invisible, and now she was being seen, not for her hands, but for her heart. A slow, dawning sense of wonder spread through her. She had not just played a song. She had told a story, and for the first time in her life, everyone had understood. The feeling was not pride. It was something deeper, something quieter. It was the profound, humbling astonishment of being truly, completely heard. The silence stretched on, becoming more and more charged with every passing second. It was a bubble that had to burst. The young woman, feeling a strange mix of exhaustion and exhilaration, slowly began to lift her hands from the keys. The small movement seemed to break the spell. A man in the front row, the one who had been wiping away a tear, took a hesitant step forward. He looked at the young woman, his eyes full of a gratitude so deep it seemed to overflow. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came out. Instead, he brought his hands together in a single, slow clap. It was a sound that was both soft and loud in the profound silence, a deliberate, heartfelt act of recognition. And it was the beginning of the flood. That single, deliberate clap was like a stone dropped in a still pond. The sound sent a ripple through the heavy silence, and for a moment it was the only sound in the vast atrium. Then another person joined in, an older woman who had been dabbing her eyes. Then a man in a worker's uniform. The claps were not fast or loud at first. They were slow, thoughtful, and full of a weight that went beyond simple appreciation. It was the sound of understanding. But the slow, respectful rhythm began to change. The emotion in the room, which had been held back by the dam of silence, now burst through. The clapping grew faster, louder, spreading from person to person until it was no longer a collection of individual sounds, but a single, massive wave of noise. It wasn't a cheer, it was an ovation. It was a roar of gratitude, of awe, of shared humanity, so loud it seemed to shake the glass walls of the atrium. People were on their feet, their faces turned towards the young woman on the bench, their expressions a mixture of tears and joyous smiles. She sat frozen, her hands still hovering over the keys. The sound was a physical force washing over her, and she flinched as if it were a bright light after a long time in darkness. Slowly, hesitantly, she lifted her head. Her eyes, wide with disbelief, scanned the crowd. She saw the hundreds of faces all turned towards her, all clapping for her. She saw the old man, his face wet with tears, clapping with a vigor that belied his age. She saw the mother, holding her little girl's hand, both of them beaming. She saw the businessman, his phone still on the floor, clapping so hard his palms were red. This was not the reaction she had ever imagined. There was no pity here. There was no mockery. There was only a raw, overwhelming, and slightly terrifying connection. She had poured her pain and her hope into the music, and the crowd had poured their love right back at her. A wave of dizziness washed over her, and she gripped the edge of the piano bench to steady herself. She felt a strange, unfamiliar warmth spread through her chest, a feeling so powerful it was almost painful. It was acceptance. Her gaze drifted, almost instinctively, to the spot by the pillar where the students had been standing. They were gone. They had slipped away during the height of the applause, melting back into the crowd like shadows at dawn. She caught a fleeting glimpse of the girl with the violin just as she disappeared through a doorway. Her head bowed, her shoulders slumped in defeat. They hadn't clapped. They couldn't. Their silence was their own form of applause, a quiet, painful acknowledgement of the lesson they had just learned. Seeing them go didn't bring her satisfaction. It just brought a quiet sense of closure. The ghosts of her past had been present to witness her triumph, and now they were gone. The thunderous applause began to soften slightly, transforming into a rhythmic, steady chant. More! 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 The sound was incredible, a demand from a crowd that didn't want the magic to end. But she had nothing left to give. The music had taken everything from her, and she was empty, a hollowed-out shell filled with a new, bewildering light. She shook her head slightly, a small, helpless gesture. She couldn't play another note. She didn't need to. The story was told. As the applause began to die down, people started to move. A few cautiously approached the piano, as if they were approaching a holy relic. They didn't crowd her or ask for autographs. They just wanted to be closer, to share in the afterglow. A few placed flowers they had been carrying on the top of the piano. One woman simply laid a hand on the polished wood, closed her eyes, and said a quiet thank you to the instrument itself. Then the man who had clapped first, the one whose tears had started it all, walked slowly towards her. He was an unremarkable man, the kind you would never notice in a crowd, but his eyes were remarkable. They were kind, and they held a deep, profound empathy. He stopped a few feet from the bench, not wanting to intrude on her space. He didn't say anything about her performance or how talented she was. He just looked at her, a gentle smile on his face, and said in a quiet, gruff voice, "Thank you for that. We all needed to hear it." And then he nodded, turned, and walked away, disappearing back into the crowd. His simple words, more than any standing ovation, broke through the last wall around her heart. It wasn't about her. It was about them. Her music had become a gift, and in giving it, she had received more than she could have ever imagined. As she sat there, trying to process the whirlwind of emotions, a woman in a smart, simple business suit approached. She moved with a quiet confidence that was different from the arrogance of the students. She had a warm, professional smile, and her eyes were clear and direct. She stopped at a respectful distance and waited until the young woman looked up at her. "I'm sorry to bother you," the woman said, her voice soft but firm. "That was one of the most moving things I have ever experienced. My name is not important, but what I do might be. I work for a national television show, one that showcases unique and inspiring human stories. She paused, letting the words sink in. We are always looking for people like you. People with a story that needs to be heard and a voice that the world needs to listen to. The woman reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a small, professional-looking card. She held it out, not pushing it, but simply offering it. There are no obligations. Please, just think about it. We can provide a platform, a stage, a way for your music to reach millions of people who need to hear it, just like we did today. The young woman just stared at the card, then back at the woman's face. It was too much. A television show? Millions of people? The idea was so far beyond her reality that it felt like a dream. She slowly reached out a trembling hand and took the card. The paper felt cool and real in her palm. The woman gave her another warm smile. Take your time, she said gently. Just don't let that voice go silent. The world would be a lesser place without it. And with that, she too turned and walked away, leaving the young woman alone on the bench, clutching a small, rectangular key to a future she had never dared to imagine. The crowd had mostly dispersed now, though many people lingered, talking in quiet, excited groups. The atrium was slowly returning to its normal rhythm, the river of people beginning to flow again. But everything was different. The air itself seemed to hum with a new energy. The young woman sat for a long time, just looking at the card in her hand, then at the piano, then at her own hands resting in her lap. She looked at the small, unique fingers, the ones that had brought her a lifetime of shame and a lifetime of secret dreams. She turned them over, studying the lines, the shape, the reality of them. For the first time, she didn't see what was missing. She saw what was there. She saw the hands that had touched a silent piano and made it weep with joy. She saw the hands that had spoken a universal language when her own voice had failed her. They were not a curse. They were not a limitation. They were a voice. A beautiful, powerful, and utterly unique voice. And she knew, with a certainty that settled deep into her bones, that she would never, ever hide them again.